Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. As Carol mentioned, my name is Katie Kasper. I'm with FIRE Foundation of Milwaukee as board president, and I'm joined today by Lauren Beckmann, also on our board, who is the former principal, now retired, of St. Robert's School in Shorewood. Between the two of us, we have, over the last several years, helped several schools through the process of the preparation of the Statement of Actual Cost for the Wisconsin SNSP program. So we're here today to share some information about what that process looks like and how you can utilize that option to better serve your students. FIRE Foundation itself is a nonprofit operating within the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. We support Catholic schools in welcoming students with disabilities and including them in the general education setting. We do then work directly with those Catholic schools in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, but are very excited to be here today with schools across the state of Wisconsin, both Catholic and non-Catholic, and helping you in this one small way in furthering your mission and supporting your students. A little bit of information about how we're going to format the presentation today. What we've done is gathered a handful of the most common questions we get regarding the Statement of Actual Cost, the statement itself, as well as the preparation process, and some questions we think we should get asked, but maybe we don't get so often. We're going to go through and answer those questions. Along the way, we would love to see your questions in the chat. We'll try to answer those throughout the presentation where it makes sense. And then we'll also take questions at the end. We also wanted to mention that our goal today is to really make this information more accessible and easily understandable for schools. There is extensive training available from the DPI that gets really into the weeds and the details of how the SNSP in general, as well as the actual cost statement option function. And we want to have this be a slightly different type of resource that really gets down to the practical aspects of doing this. You know, what do you need to know to get started would be something we want you to come out of this meeting with. So with that, I'm going to flip to the first question and we'll get started. The first question is very basic, but it's just meant to level set the conversation. So what are the different types of SNSP scholarships available? This particular language we've taken directly from the DPI, just so that we're all speaking the same language in this conversation. There are 3 different types of scholarships available to SNSP students. The first one on the left, the full scholarship, is the scholarship that probably the majority of your students are on, or if you're joining the program this year, will be on. This for Nick this year is expected to be $15,409. Any student who is a full-time student, so not a half day, not a kindergartner, and enrolled in your school and in the SNSP, both the count dates in September and January, is going to receive this type of payment, $15,409. There's a second scholarship called a partial scholarship. It's not a part of the full scholarship. That's kind of weird terminology. It's not for a half-year student or anything like that. That's for those students who previously were enrolled in SNSP at your school, now are no longer eligible. You're still getting that payment amount for them. We won't really talk about that today at all. Then on the right is really our area of focus, that actual cost scholarship. The amount of that scholarship is going to vary specific to the student. Importantly, it has a formula, which we'll get into, but it has no cap. So it could get as high as it needs to be to kind of keep up with the expenses associated with that student. And this is going to be received by any student currently eligible for the SNSP and enrolled who has expenses reported from the prior year on a statement of actual cost. The important inference there is that if a student is in their first year at your school, they will never be an actual cost scholarship student. They always have to have that one prior year of recorded costs at your school in order to receive that type of scholarship in the current year. Okay. Skipping ahead here to question number 2. How does the statement of actual cost impact a student's scholarship amount? First of all, it will increase the scholarship amount. If you submit a statement of actual cost, you're going to have expenses in excess of the $15,409, which is the full scholarship amount. You will get an increased amount. What that increased amount is depends a little bit upon how large that total expense number is that you report. And it's based on this very specific formula, which we've detailed at the bottom here. So you will get dollar for dollar every expense that you report on that statement up to 150% of the full scholarship amount. So I'm just going to flip back just so we're all clear. The full scholarship amount is this $15,409 on the left. So now a fourth amount to keep in mind is the 150% of it, which you can see is listed there. You will get up to that 23,114 every single dollar you report on the statement of actual cost. To the extent you have expenses that exceed that amount, the 23,114, you will also get 90% of those incremental expenses. So again, 150% of the scholarship amount dollar for dollar, that's the 23,114, 90% of anything else above that. And that's why we say all or substantially all. You're going to get, if your costs are up to that 23,000 amount, you're going to get all of them in the next year's scholarship. If they go above, you're still going to get the vast majority of those expenses. You're going to come back to you in the next year's scholarship. Just to try and make this as clear as possible, a few examples. So if you report for a student a cost of 17,500, that's under that 150%. You're going to get every dollar of that the next year, 17,500. If you report 18,500, you'll get 18,500. If you report 23,114, you're going to get 23,114. It's really an example too, where the little more complicated aspect of the formula comes into play. Let's say you report a cost of $30,000 for a student. That student, again, is going to get the 23,114, and then that incremental piece from 23,114 up to 30,000, you're going to get 90% of that for a total scholarship amount of 29,311. Example 3 here really functions exactly the same as example 2, but the reason that I wanted to put this on the page is just to show that the scholarship can get really big if you have a large reported cost amount. So let's say you have a student whose reported cost is 120,000. And as we go on, we'll get into what could be in that in detail. But I think there's probably some people looking at that number thinking, okay, what would that even be? You could have this type of student at your school. It's probably a student who has a one-on-one aid, significant pull-out instruction with a special education teacher, maybe some really significant technology needs, students who need a lot of outside therapy. Some complex students are going to have a constellation of these things in their service plan, and these service costs can get really high. If you report, let's say, $120,000 on that statement of actual cost, again, you're going to get the 23,114, and you will also get 90% of that incremental from 23,114 up to the 120,000. So your new scholarship amount for that student then will be, then the next year, 110,311.
So the next question is, which students should be considered for an actual cost scholarship? And as Katie kind of implied there pretty clearly, any students with service agreements that cost substantially in excess of the standard per pupil SNSP payment, that 15,409 or whatever it was, 409. Those are the students for which you could consider applying. This will usually apply to students that have dedicated staff, such as a special education teacher that provides pull-out instruction, perhaps in literacy and math, a personal aid, and or individualized therapy services, usually speech or OT or something like that. But as Katie implied, it could be a vision teacher, it could be a teacher for the hearing impaired, it could be any of those things. So when you have a particular student that has dedicated staff, and the costs are high, you probably want to consider an actual cost statement. The election is per student per year. So you can move students in and out of this, and you do need to apply for them each year. So your costs may vary from year to year, and you can always know that in the year following the expense, you will get reimbursed for those expenses of the previous year. Katie, did you want to give some idea of how many schools are actually participating to date?
I would love to. So this next bit of information is actually, this is a screen grab right from the DPI website. And they report annually the number of schools and students related to actual cost statements, as well as the costs and payments for those statements of actual cost. And as you can see here, in this time period, which dates back to 2018, 2019, the total participation in SNSP has grown about tenfold. but the participation in the actual cost option has barely grown at all. I guess we could say it doubled, but it's 3 additional students. So what is the relevance to this question about who can be included? What we want to mention today is just, we just want to encourage you to think about what students could utilize this option. Think carefully. And I would put them in sort of 3 categories. So the first category is students who are at your school whose costs exceed this full scholarship amount, but for one reason or another, just have not historically had a statement of actual cost. And that's actually more common than you might think. When we talk to schools, it's either they weren't aware of this option. That's pretty normal. That's one of the reasons we want to get this information out there. Sometimes it's that the program itself has so many compliance features and paperwork, and this is just the last thing that you haven't gotten to yet. And it can seem like just one more thing to add to the pile, but really when you distill down what you have to do and the amount of incremental funding you can get for those kids who, again, you're already serving in excess of the full scholarship amount, it really is, it's worth the time and the energy that you put into it. And then the second category that I would really encourage school leaders to think about is students in your school that you're already serving, but if you just had a little more funding, you would do more for them. And, you know, it's probably true of many, many students that we're doing a great job serving them in our schools, but, you know, they might be better off if they had this type of therapy, or maybe you talk to the parents and they've elected to do something after school that ideally would be done during the school day. How can you better expand the services provided to those kids in your school if you just had this little bit of incremental funding? And then the third category, and this is like right at the heart of the mission of FIRE Foundation, so I have to bring it up, is who are the kids outside of your immediate school community that aren't yet in the building because you haven't traditionally had the funding available to properly serve them. This could be kids whose maybe their siblings are in your school. If you're a church related school, maybe they're in your church community, but they have not been able to attend your school. And maybe they're totally far afield from the immediate circle of your community. But start thinking about ways with this incremental funding, students who haven't traditionally been served in private schools for practical reasons could be brought into the fold and benefit from a private or religious education.
So a couple of relevant questions were submitted by participants that are sort of related to this, and I want to address those here. Someone asked, do we have to figure out the actual cost per SNSP student, or only if it exceeds the normal scholarship amount? And hopefully the answer is pretty clear by now. No, this is completely optional, but highly encouraged if you have costs that exceed the regular scholarship amount. So you can apply for just one student, you can apply for several students, you can apply for all of your students or none of them. That is completely up to you. And another question was, how or when do schools determine if they don't have the necessary support and resources for a specific student? Hopefully we've gotten you thinking a little bit about the fact that even if you don't have those services, you could potentially have those services if you had some help paying for them. What I want to be clear about here is that your school profile that's published on the DPI's SNSP website determines the limits of what you must offer, what you choose to offer. So this is completely controlled by the school. But you don't have the option not to accept a student who applies for enrollment. Students must be accepted into the SNSP in the order that eligible applications are received. So what happens then if you get an application for a student for whom you don't currently offer the correct services? You would do one of two things. You can be clear to the parents that you have limits of service that you will provide and that you do not believe those services are adequate to meet the needs of their child. Or you can choose to offer additional services beyond what your profile describes and pay for those with actual cost accounting. The bottom line here is that agreed upon services are documented, must be documented on your agreement of services signed by both the administrator and the parent. And once that happens, you can then from that point forward apply for actual cost reimbursement. I think we can go to our next question.
Actually, there's a couple of questions in the chat.
Okay.
The first one from David is regarding an 8th grade student that has an actual cost established already, and then they transfer to a high school, what happens? Does that actual cost scholarship follow them in their first year of high school? This is a great question, David.
This really gets to the heart of the mechanics of the actual cost option and the, let's just say, the less than ideal features of it. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. So maybe I'm just going to reserve that question. And I saw the question prior to it is kind of similar. The short answer is it's a full reset. So you start over, but we'll get into that a little bit and how that works and how it looks in a couple slides. That's a really great question.
So our next question is how and when are actual cost statements submitted? And then when are the payments received? So this is pretty nuts and bolts kind of stuff. Statements are always due the third Friday in July, where you're attempting to recoup costs from the previous year that just finished. That will not change from year to year. So you can always kind of have that on your radar, third Friday in July. Go ahead. Nope, I thought someone was going to say something. Payments are received, as Katie said earlier, in the fiscal year following the one in which the expenses were incurred. But those payments will be received on the same quarterly schedule as your regular SNSP payments. So September, November, February, and May of the year following the year in which the costs were incurred, you will receive those actual cost payments. So I think just to reinforce what we said earlier, the school will have to have an alternate funding plan for that first year of expenses, because that first year you will only get the 15,409 or whatever the regular payment is in any given year. So you'll have to have a funding plan for that gap, but beginning in year 2, you will get always what you had spent the year before. But conversely, if expenses would happen to drop in year 2, say a student doesn't need a dedicated aide any longer, the school would still recoup the year 1 expenses in that following year. So they're just always a year late, but always on that same quarterly schedule. And your documentation will always be due third Friday in July.
Okay, this is what I think is sort of this is the most common question that I get asked. What can I actually put on this statement of actual cost? And there are multiple ways to answer this question, but I think a really important high-level general principle is it has to be a special education related expense that's specific to the student. So if the general ed cost for that student cannot be included on this statement, and then general special ed expenses, like let's just say you have a special ed administrator, you cannot include any of that cost. It has to be kind of directly traceable to that student. I know there's a variety of backgrounds for people on this call. If you have a background in public education at all, I would say the types of expenses you could include on this are virtually identical to the services and supports that would be included in a public school IEP. If they're not part of if they wouldn't qualify for a public school IEP as part of the provision of FAPE, they probably don't fit on the statement of actual cost. It was kind of the categories were just basically lifted from the IDEA. So that's the general type of cost. We have listed here the 5 very specific ways that DPI describes these, and I'm actually going to break them into two categories. So number 1 is kind of a category in and of itself. If an item is in a student's IEP or service plan, I just want to put a little asterisk here. The service plan is different from the agreement of services. Similar terms, but a service plan is similar to an IEP, a document prepared by the public school evaluation team, typically for a student placed in a private school. So what the DPI has said is if a service has met the bar for that public school team to add it to a child's plan, then it would qualify as a statement of actual cost item. The other 4 items 2, 3, 4, 5 on this slide are sort of a different category, and that's just any other thing agreed to between the private school and the parents, even if it wasn't in the public school IEP, that fits into one of these 4 categories, can be included on that statement of actual cost. And so again, we want to get down to the practical application of this. What that means is If you have a student evaluated by the public school district and they say student qualifies for an IEP, but we would only provide them, 2 sessions per week of speech therapy. And you decide in conjunction with the parents that that student actually needs 4 sessions per week of speech therapy. You are not limited to the 2 sessions on the statement of actual cost. You can put all 4 on that statement of actual cost. A similar situation with any other item that fits into 2, 3, 4, 5 agreed upon between the parent and the school. So you are not limited to things in the public school IEP or service plan produced for that child. You can make modifications to it. They do have to fall into these buckets. So specially designed instruction, that would be like pull-out instruction, not just in your typical subjects, but also, I think Lauren mentioned, teachers of deaf and hard of hearing, visually impaired would fall into that. Adaptive PE is another one. The item number 3, the supplementary aids and services. These are all the things the student needs to participate in the gen ed classroom as a result of their disability status. So that could be a personnel, it could be a one-on-one aid. It might be technology related. It could be equipment or furniture. And then the related services is really this big bucket of, that almost summarize it by saying therapy, but there's a bunch of things that fit into it. And actually, if you go on the DPI website, download the Excel template for the statement of actual cost, they will list what all of those individual detailed things are. And then the last one, number 5, I think is a little bit less intuitive when you read it. Okay, school personnel services, what does this mean? Those are things that school personnel do in order to sort of prepare themselves to serve the child. So if you had a special ed teacher who needed general continuing ed to serve students in general, that would not qualify. But if you had a student, let's say, who came in with a very student-specific need that required training. So say you have a nonverbal student who uses a communication device, and you want to have a paraprofessional go through a training course on how to work with kids with those types of devices, you could put that expense, because it's specific to that student, on that statement of actual cost. Lauren mentioned this a couple of slides ago. This is a big change for the coming school year. The things you put on the statement of actual cost must check one of these 5 boxes, and also must be in the agreement of services. So previously, including for this past school year, on those statement of actual costs that you're probably in the process of preparing right now, you did not, or again, for this past year, do not need to have these items listed in that agreement of services between the private school and the parent. But going forward, beginning with this coming school year, the DPI is going to ask to see that agreement of services and will not allow any costs that aren't in the agreement of services. And you need to show, if you add a service, what the date of addition is. So again, getting down to the practical aspect of this, making sure you have a process for getting these things in the agreement of services so that they can be reported in the statement of actual cost will be very important.
So just to emphasize, you can modify an agreement of services at any point during a school year. But when that modification is implemented, you need to have a new dated document or a modified document that is signed and dated by both school administrator and parent at that point in time. You will only be paid from the date of the signatures on that document forward.
There is a question in the chat I see that says, there's a couple, I'll come back to one of them, but one of them is relevant to this slide. If the student's general education costs are not included in actual cost, then how are those expenses covered? Right now, we look at the funds available for a student's special education expenses as the amount of a student's SNSP payment that exceeds a typical choice voucher. Okay, this is a great question. And this is a very school-specific situation. The different schools really approach, in our experience, the SNSP funding differently, and how they account for it, how they allocate it to students, how directly they tie it to students. It sounds like this question comes from a school that uses parental choice vouchers. So if your students are generally on vouchers and you put them in the SNSP program, the incremental amount of funding you're going to get is going to be small, right? Because you're losing that choice voucher. You're going to get at least the full scholarship from the SNSP. So that's about an incremental, the elementary level, $5,000. those expenses in excess of whether it's $5,000 that you internally say is the student's specialized service funding, or if you're using the full 15 for that student, if you're not at voucher school, or if you think about it differently, any incremental expenses are covered by the school. So, and in this case, even if you look at any student with a statement of actual cost, when it starts to exceed that 150%, you're always going to have the 10% that's not covered. Again, that's covered by the school. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that because that becomes just much more of a philosophical question. The DPI leaves it to you to figure out what to do. And we can get into that a little bit more, how FIRE Foundation plays into that. Maybe that'll kind of come in at the end of the conversation.
And someone just asked a question also about whether benefits can be included in addition to salaries, and the answer to that is yes. So salaries and benefits prorated as the services that they provide applied to a particular child. So let's say, for example, that you have a teacher that's working with a small group of 3 at one time, and 2 of those students have actual cost accounting. You would have to prorate the time as shared among those 2 students or 3 students, and a prorated amount of their benefits as well.
Just to sort of make this a little easier to think about visually, what you see here is 2 screen grabs that are from the actual statement of actual cost. So again, if you go on the DPI website and the SNSP portion of the site, you can currently download the Excel file that is essentially a template for the 2023-2024 school year statement of actual cost. I would actually encourage you, even if you aren't doing one for this past school year, if you're not going to complete one, just to download it and look at it, because it gives you a lot of information about how this works. There's 2 important schedules on that statement of actual cost. The first one, they're each their own tab. The first one is these invoice costs. This is just the top of it. The lines go on and on down for however many invoices you have. But basically any cost that's invoiced, so not your own personnel, whether it's something you purchased or a contracted person that comes in to do some sort of service for your students, you're going to get an invoice. You're going to put some basic information from that invoice. You are going to check on the right side. If you see columns G through K on the top, those align perfectly with items 1 through 5 on this prior slide. You're going to check one of those, and then this will ultimately start calculating the total cost at the bottom. Staff cost is a separate schedule. It functions a little differently. You know, we just had that question about the benefits. You can see here, you're going to put in the salaries and wages. If you say, yes, we pay FICA for this individual, it will automatically add that into the calculation. There's a column for those benefits. Anywhere that there's yellow, you're going to be entering information. The rest of it calculates on its own. Again, you're checking off which of these 5 things, which of these 5 boxes does this item check? It could be more than one. And then this sort of dovetails with the next question on the next slide, which is about allocating costs. So how are expenses allocated on a statement of actual cost? You're going to have some items listed on this statement that are not necessarily 100% specific to the student. So I'm going to flip back to this screen grab just to talk about this. So if you look at the top, it's actually in both cases, it's column E. You're going to report the total cost of the item, whatever it is, even if it was shared by multiple students, and then you're going to indicate the percentage that relates to this particular student. So as an example, and I guess before I get into an example, I should state very clearly, the allocation is, the way they describe it is specific to the expense. What they mean by that is that you have to allocate the cost in a reasonable way depending on what that expense is. So if you have 10 special ed students in your school, you don't just divide every cost by 10. You have to think about what type of cost is this? What's the reasonable way to divide it up? So let's say you purchase some sort of adaptive curriculum and 2 students use it. That would be a situation where you could just say, okay, half of that was for this one student, half was for the other. So I'm going to put 50% on this statement of actual cost. Another situation might be totally different. You could have a speech therapist who comes in and invoices for minutes of service in the school. You're going to need that speech therapist to break out the minutes by student, and then you're going to allocate a percentage based on the minutes spent with that student. A staff cost internally would be done similarly. You might say, okay, but actually what they've asked you to do, thankfully, is not to track every moment that every teacher spends throughout the whole school year, but they've said, find a representative couple weeks of the school year, that's sort of a typical couple weeks, have the staff track their time during that period, and then again, use the kind of the percentage of time spent directly with the student or prepping for the student to allocate the total cost to each individual student. And again, you don't have to do it for every student that teacher serves, but if you're just focused on this one statement of actual cost for one child, you need to figure out what percentage of the teacher's time is spent with that particular child. So again, these are going to be they're going to be student specific. You also have to allocate based on time spent on special ed. So you may have let's say you have an aide, they spend 80% of their time one-on-one providing specialized support to a special ed student who's in the SNSP, but they spend 20% of their time doing recess duty. Well, again, you're going to report the total cost of that personnel within your school, and then you're going to put 80% in that column E, and that's how you're going to ultimately calculate what's particular to this specific student. Just checking the questions real quick. Can you please speak to reporting requirements for invoices and hour-by-hour audit requirements? It sounds like in the past, the DPI has asked for each paycheck for actual cost related employees, and it must match hour by hour usage. So yes, this is familiar. In the past, the DPI has asked for a very specific actual record, moment by moment, of how personnel has spent their time, which quite frankly is a huge unreasonable undertaking for us, what most of you are, which is small school leaders. The DPI has not announced a change on that, but they have just begun describing different requirements without pointing out that it's a change. So this concept of a representative week or 2 weeks of the school year is definitely new. It's not highlighted in their new items, but they are now no longer saying they need to know minute by minute, you know, if a staff member was sick one day, do we now have to shuffle around and change the percentage based on that? Or if the student was sick, none of those things apply. You don't need a minute by minute accounting. We're not attorneys billing by the hour here. We just need that representative week, thankfully, which should significantly reduce the administrative burden in completing the statement of actual cost. Just checking if anything else. If a service plan has life skills as a service and your school does not have equipment such as a stove or washer or dryer, can that be included in actual cost? It's a good one. I'm going to say that the answer is yes to that question. I haven't run into that in particular, but some similar situations. We've had a student with visual impairment who has needed equipment that is not available at the school, and some of that costs more than a stove or washer or dryer. And yes, that equipment goes in the statement of actual cost, and it actually goes in at the total amount in the year it was purchased. It's not, it doesn't have, it's not, because it's a capital expense, it's not spread out over multiple years or anything like that. That does go in that statement of actual cost. If you already have minute by minute documentation, can that be submitted in lieu of the sample week? I would expect that yes, that sounds like a higher degree of documentation, and so yes. Or if that's, we can speak a little bit to the back and forth you might get from DPI, but if they reject that approach, I would say that you have the representative week embedded in that, and you can just go ahead and pick one and revise the way you've done it. Okay, I think that kind of gets us through all the questions on that.
Hey,
Carol,
Sam,
unless you have something else.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. Sam wanted to know where this announcement or lack thereof regarding staff time tracking. And it was mentioned in the recent training, and I'd have to double check to see if it was in their DPI slide deck, but it was gone over in that recent training that they had. Was that about 2 weeks ago?
Yes, and it was in the slide deck as well, so I think you will find it there.
And
yeah, so, and to be clear, that slide deck is still available on the DPI website. They don't record the actual training itself. So if it was anything in the voiceover, you wouldn't have, but that was part of that from a couple of weeks ago.
And they had said, in terms of the next question there, what is representative? I had understood it to be just a couple representative weeks. Lauren, is that what you?
Yes, and we say representative because we might want to distinguish, for example, between summer school and the regular school year. So you might have the same employee working different tasks and different responsibilities during each of those sessions. And so you would need a representative week from summer as distinct from a representative week during the school year. And I think that's what they meant by representative. So if something changes, you would need to show that differently. And that sort of leads into our next question. And really, Katie kind of covered all of this, but just to kind of capture it again in a more concise way, what documentation do we need to submit to support the statement of actual cost? You're going to need your complete payroll records for any personnel costs, and that would include payroll taxes and benefits, as we mentioned earlier. Along with that, you will be asked for teacher contracts or for any contracted employees. You will need to provide their contract, employment agreements, and you should have written employment agreements for hourly employees and aides and so forth. And then you will need their actual, hours worked, and you're going to show that in schedules, most likely. So schedules for your aides, who they're working with when, sort of their daily and weekly schedule, so we can see the actual names of the students tracking with their time. This is probably the most cumbersome thing to produce, so I would just caution you to produce it in a very detail-oriented way on the front end, rather than trying to reproduce it at the time that you're submitting your actual cost statement. So create schedules at the beginning of the year, have them be in a nice, spreadsheet kind of format, update them and date, with a date on them whenever there are any changes made. So we know that, Mrs. Jones is working with Susie and Johnny at a certain time, 3 times a week. And those are students who are in actual cost accounting. So you can easily just highlight that and attach it as your representative week of schedule. For your Schedule 1 invoices for any purchased items, those also have to be pretty detailed. So make sure that your vendors detail exactly what was purchased, and that you have then a way of tracking that to your services agreement, that was something that was needed, for the services agreement. So just make sure to dot your I's and cross your T's. For OT, PT, and other kinds of therapy services, make sure that when your private contractors submit their invoices to the school for payment, that they list the names of the students and the amount of minutes or hours that they're charging for each week or each month, however the billing is done, because those will also need to be provided. So it's just really documentation of everything that you're putting in that spreadsheet. And then finally, the agreement of services that we mentioned. And that, as I understand it, does not need to be provided for the things that you're submitting this month, but next year you will need that. So make sure that going forward, beginning with your August agreement, that you have really a lot of detail in there, and that any modifications are always dated and signed. Any questions on that?
Lauren, I would just add to that, you made a great point about trying to gather these things as you go along throughout the year is much easier than doing it right now, for example. And that's not to discourage schools from doing a statement of actual cost for a student right now. If they haven't been tracking throughout the year, it can still be done, but really would encourage you, again, getting down to the practical aspects of this, set up a system that sort of provides you these things as you go along. So especially as it relates to the invoices, most organizations, you're going to have a person approving the invoice and a person paying, and kind of maybe record keeping could be together as function together. Often it's the principal, let's say, who signs off on an invoice. Just begin the practice of, if it's an SNSP invoice, just write SNSP on it for your record keeper. And if you can, at the beginning of the school year, identify those students who are most probably going to have extensive costs for the year, start writing an identifier for the student. So, maybe it's just as simple as the student's initials, SNSP, student JK, that gets scanned and put in a pile so that when you hit June 30th, and you're ready to do that statement of actual cost, the invoices are all piled up. It's not only the backup, but it actually is your own source document for preparing that statement anyway. So, and then the other thing that I had mentioned earlier, but I just want to hit it again, as Lauren explained, you have to have that in that agreement of services. Just begin a procedural practice at your school where anytime you modify whatever is being provided to any student, you go back to that service agreement and you sign a date and add it in there. And I would say it's a low cost action to have to take. So err on the side of I would put everything in there if it were my school or my student.
Yes, and to do it for all students, not just the ones that you think you're going to submit a statement of actual cost. Just do it for all of them all the time. And you never know when you might add a student in, and then you'll have the documentation that you need. We did have a question submitted ahead of time that asked about what type of record keeping is advised. And hopefully we have covered that, but I would just add to that, your progress reports are really important documentation as well, and they may not be required specifically for the statement of actual cost, but they are required for all SNSP students. So you should just make sure that those are always done and that they're of high quality. There is a DPI template for that, and as well you can attach any kind of additional reports, report cards, progress reports, intervention reports that your school provides historically that are maybe more detailed than what the DPI is requiring, and simply attach those. So you should be able to provide those on a moment's notice and not have to recreate them or beef them up when you're asked for those. Those should always be done as a matter of course by any personnel that are working with students. And I would say I would include private contractors in that as well.
I see a question, if counseling is needed and part of the agreement of services, can that be counted as well? Yes, the answer to that is yes. And in fact, counseling is one of the items specifically listed by the DPI as a qualifying expense if it's in that agreement of services. And actually, that particular question has prompted in my mind a slightly different topic. That this again gets down to the practicalities of it. So counseling is one that jumps out to me because this is an example of a service that frequently a parent will, in choosing between a public and private school, will elect to bring the counseling outside of the school day, put that expense somewhere else in their budget in order to get them into a private school that just couldn't pay for the counseling. This is also commonly done with therapies like OT or PT. So, maybe a student's enrolled in public school, the parent wants them in Catholic school, and they say, you know what, we'll take the student to outpatient occupational therapy. We'll pay for that through insurance or perhaps out of pocket. And then we won't do it at school, but we really want them in that faith-based school or this private school where other children attend or whatever it may be. In some cases, we also have parents who will actually pay for those services to enter into the school building, again, out of their own pocket or maybe through insurance. And I would just encourage any school leaders to think about if there is a student who you could add that into the service plan as an appropriate educational expense. Add that back into the student service plan so that you, on behalf of that family, can start accessing some of the funding available to that child through the state. Even if you have an agreement with the family that says in that first year, when it's not included in a statement of actual cost, you're going to invoice the family for it. That's a whole school level decision, but at least then in the next year you can start receiving some of that funding. So again, thinking about those kids who could be served by this actual cost option, but currently aren't for whatever reason, that would be another category of those types of students.
Definitely. And I think we can all agree that we are seeing more and more trauma-based disabilities in the emotional and behavioral realm. So I think counseling becomes a really relevant service.
Okay, before we move on to from the documentation aspect of it, I actually want to add a sub question that I wish we would have put in here, which is what can be expected after all of this is actually submitted to the DPI? And this is not covered in their training at all. And I'm just going to speak a little bit from my experience. I know Lauren can do the same. You can't be totally sure A few years ago, you kind of submitted the information and then the scholarship amount was adjusted and everyone went on their way. In the last couple of years, I will say that the schools that have gone through the actual cost statement submission process have seen a little bit more follow-up from the DPI. And what that has typically looked like is directly email, like a series of questions. I would say in some cases, probing questions, kind of poking at the information included. In some cases, just asking for additional documentation that didn't come through, or, you know, an invoice actually didn't have the information needed. So you're going to get a follow-up question on that. So I mention this not to scare anyone away from the process, but just more so to say, if you submit a statement of actual cost and you get a response that includes, you know, 10 follow-up questions, don't be intimidated by that. Just understand, take those questions one at a time, go through them item by item, answer them to the best of your ability, send them off. And you might get a second iteration of that. But in our experience, not universally, but generally in our experience, that has sort of settled the matter. So expect, again, we mentioned there were only 7 students that were on actual cost scholarships for this year. If you're one of just a handful, it's very easy for someone at DPI to look through those, you know, in an afternoon and come up with questions. So don't be surprised or intimidated by that particular thing happening.
And there's
Just
a follow.
check-ins.
There's a follow-up
Yes.
question here. Are there resources or any being prepared for what boundaries are and are not appropriate in terms of these probing questions? What limits are placed on this reach from the DPI? So that's a sensitive question, I think. And I think what we need to remember is, you know, kind of the balance. It's our job to try and provide the highest quality education and to get that funding that's available to do that. It's the DPI's job to be responsible stewards of our tax dollars and the funding, right? And so in some ways it can seem like we're at odds with each other, but I think if we think about it in terms of we're each operating in our own realms and doing our own jobs and you know, sort of seek to be partners in that work, I think we can make it work, as Katie said. But to answer the question, there are no really limits or boundaries that I'm aware of, and government, you know, has a heavy hand. So I think we just have to be prepared for that, and try to partner with them in a responsible way. There is another question about medical insurance. If a child receives OT, are we obligated to bill their medical insurance, or can we pay the OT directly and then submit that cost under statement of actual cost? And I would say the answer is determined by whether the services are education-based or more medically based. And there is, of course, overlap with many students who have medically based disabilities. But you certainly, as long as the service and its outcomes and goals are defined in the agreement of services and are education-based, you certainly can apply for those under actual cost accounting, and you have no obligation ever to apply for medical reimbursement. That would be a parent's responsibility if any of that were to be covered by medical insurance. So I see those as kind of 2 distinct realms, but I'm sure they overlap. And Katie, you could probably address that from personal experience better than I could.
Well, I would just say that there's even if private insurance or Medicaid would cover the service provided in the school, that, you know, sometimes there's this overlap where some of the educational related therapy goals also qualify as medical goals. You see this in the public school quite frequently, where many public schools will bill Medicaid as a matter of course. They kind of get one-time permission from the parent, and that permission stands until revoked. There is no rule that says you must do that before putting an item on a statement of actual cost. So there's not, Medicaid, for example, is not considered like a necessary first payer of these expenses. It's totally your option. And I would say it's, you know, it probably makes sense not to do that for most schools, just given the heavy lift involved in that, and the availability of this option.
There's another question. Will the fact that we receive Title I reading services impact whether we can use actual cost scholarship dollars to pay for additional reading intervention services by a salaried employee? That should not bar you from doing that at all, no.
If you have intervention that's funded by title funds and it's directly to a student who has a statement of actual cost, you could not report that item on the statement of actual cost since the title funds cover it, but you could hire one person with title funds that serves kids who are not on IEPs or whatever it may be, and then you hire a separate person to do some of these services that are in the agreement of services with families, and pay for that through their school general budget, and then report that in the statement of actual cost.
That would be a real clean way of doing it.
Okay. The next question is, what if a student with an actual cost scholarship transfers between schools or graduates? And actually the answer to this question is the same, and maybe it's better asked as what if a student changes schools, whether it's through transfer or graduation? This is the biggest drawback of the actual cost statement provision. A student who is in a first year at their school for any reason whatsoever will not be able to receive an actual cost payment. So in order to receive that payment, the student had to be enrolled at the same school the prior year. The costs have to be incurred at that school. So I can't take an 8th grader who graduates and report their cost, have that, let's say they graduate from an elementary school. The elementary school has a statement of actual cost, passes it off to me at the high school, sends it into the DPI. They will not give you an actual cost scholarship for 9th grade. You're back, you reset again, you're back at the 15,419 for this school year. If you're thinking of accepting a transfer student or a kindergartner with significant services, just know you're always going to have that first year where you just receive the full scholarship amount, and you're not going to be able to have those costs included in what you receive from the DPI. Even if you have a student who comes, in, let's say your K through 8 school, or K through 12, even they go from kindergarten through 12th grade at your school, after the 12th grade year, you will not receive a payment for that student in the following school year because they're no longer enrolled. So from a practical standpoint, this just means that you have to solve for the first year of funding, that there's no way around it. If Lauren and I were writing the legislation, we would not have written it this way, but this is the way it works. And I'll say that it's kind of there's two sides to this coin. This is an amazing benefit for students with disabilities in the state of Wisconsin. And there's probably no other state in the country where there's so much funding available for kids who really have significant educational needs. On the flip side, if you cannot figure out how to fund that first year of expenses for such a student, you'll never be able to access the funds. And I guess that sort of leads us into our last question here.
And before we get to that, there was a submitted question here that said, we had a student who needed much more service in February. So we hired an aide for him for 2 days a week, and we covered the rest. Wasn't enough this year to turn in. So would this count as his first year free option? And we can apply next year with more services and documentation. So this is confusing. And I'm hoping that Katie clarified that a little bit in what she just said, but just to reiterate, the first year that you submit documentation, if you didn't submit it or you're not going to submit it this month, will be next July, and it will be to recoup the costs of your 24-25 school year. So during 24-25, you will have to come up with a way to pay that aid out of your own budget or resources, or charging tuition to a parent, or however you might want to do that, using scholarship funds that the school has. Another way to pay for it, because you won't get reimbursed until 25-26 for those costs. I hope that's clear.
I would just add to that, you can absolutely do a statement of actual cost for a student who enters the program in the middle of the year, but it sounds like in that situation, the partial year of costs did not rise to the level that would exceed the full scholarship for this year. They do not, let's say the student's in your school for a third of the school year, they do not look at your 1/3 year costs and kind of gross that up times 3 to figure out what it would be. It's based on the actual incurred, even if it was only for a partial year. And this gets into a lot of the technicalities, but interestingly, even if a student joins the SNSP program, let's say you have a student join the SNSP after the count date in January, you wouldn't receive any payment for them for that school year because they enter after the payment cutoff date, but you actually could receive an actual cost statement scholarship for them the next year if the costs rose to the level that they, even in that small stub year, exceeded the 15,000. So it's not based on the count date. It's just based on, did you get that student enrolled, and do the actual costs incurred, regardless of what portion of the year it was, exceed the amount of the full scholarship.
Correct. And so someone is just recapping for us. So the first year and a last year of an SNSP student, you cannot do actual costs. Well, you won't recoup those costs. Correct. So how to get funds for that 8th grader that's leaving. So Katie, did you want to address that any further?
Yeah, so I would be happy to. So yes, this is stated, well, it's stated somewhat correctly. So for the first year, you receive a full scholarship payment, which is the 15,400, but you complete a statement of actual cost at the end of the year, which is based on the year 1 costs and paid in year 2. That pattern will follow. So when the student's in 8th grade, you'll submit a statement based on 7th grade and receive the amount during 8th grade. You're always that 1 year in arrears. So when they finish 8th grade, no, you do not prepare a statement of actual cost. You do not get a payment for them because they're not enrolled in your school. So assuming a student's costs are level every single year, which would never be the case, but let's just say a student's costs are always 50 grand. You're going to begin getting a payment based on the 50 grand in the second year they're in the school. And it relates to the prior year, but you'll get that payment every year thereafter. It's kind of the first year where if you just isolate that one student's costs and the scholarship they receive, you're going to be out the difference between the costs and the full scholarship amount.
Right.
So
So in the 8th grade, I'm sorry.
Mention that one thing that DPI reiterates when they have these conversations is that the actual cost model is only a reset of the scholarship amount. It's not a reimbursement. And we tend to think of it as a reimbursement. So that's why this very excellent question about the 8th grader, when they leave your school, you're not going to get anything for them because, again, it's not a reimbursement model. It's just a reset if they're at your school the following year.
A reset of the voucher, correct. So, to bring that to reality, in the student's 8th grade year, you are getting that reset amount that was established for their 7th grade year. So if it was 50,000, you're still getting that 50,000 in their 8th grade year. But once they graduate out and move to another school, you're not getting a reimbursement of what you actually spent in the 8th grade year, if that makes sense. Yes. Complex, yes, but it is doable when you digest it a little bit at a time. And we're always here for you.
Okay.
So our last question. How can actual cost scholarships help schools to welcome complex learners? As Katie mentioned at the outset, it is the mission of FIRE Foundation to increase accessibility for special needs learners to the schools of their choice, of their parents' choice. And actual cost vouchers can certainly help us to do that, to the extent that they allow a school to hire dedicated special education and support staff. They allow us to contract with therapy providers. They allow us to purchase equipment and instructional materials that are needed to provide a quality educational product for any complex learner. So what I would say is when a student with complex learning needs comes to your door and inquires about enrollment, what you should do really is partner with the parents and look at ways that you can create a quality program for that child. Put a pencil to it, figure out how much it would cost, and please really do look into this actual cost accounting model as a substantial way that you can increase that accessibility to our excellent private schools for complex learners.
And I would just add to be creative about how to solve for the first year. Lauren has done this at St. Robert's. We've done it at several other schools with kids who really are extremely high needs. That you could make an agreement with the parent that the parent pays out of pocket. That is not the ideal for me, but that is the starting point for some schools, and parents are willing to do that to unlock the access to that private school, perhaps that religious education for, you know, up to a 10 or even 12, 14-year period, depending on what type of school you are. I think it's better to think of ways the community can more broadly support some of these learners. I would remind everyone on this call, in all likelihood, your school loses money on every single kid that comes in the door, and you find some way to close the funding gap for those kids. Most private schools are charging a tuition that's below, probably significantly below the cost of education. And so this is, again, it's about mission. It's no different. I would encourage you to look to outside funding sources. FIRE Foundation is standing by. Again, we serve Catholic schools within the Archdiocese of Milwaukee. We are standing by waiting for grant applications. A slam dunk grant application would be, hey, we have a kindergartner coming in with significant needs. We're trying to solve the first year of funding for that student. Can you give us a grant? Even if you receive a private grant or a tuition payment from a parent to cover the student's educational costs, those can still go into the statement of actual costs. It's really just the government funded items that can't go in there. Another thing to keep in mind is if you think of your program holistically, broadly, odds are you have many, many students who come in the door, they get that actual cost payment, or excuse me, not actual cost, full scholarship payment, and their service needs are much lower. And so you have this pool of funds that is dedicated for special ed, and it needs to go somewhere. This would be a great opportunity to bring in some of those students who, again, traditionally haven't been served in our private schools, and really unlock what is an enormous amount of funding available if you can just problem solve that first year.
Well said, well said. And someone has just submitted a question. I'm sorry, this may have been answered already. Can a partial scholarship student utilize actual cost scholarships? If you remember from earlier in the presentation, the definition of partial scholarship isn't what your English language instincts might tell you that it is. Partial scholarship means that a student no longer meets eligibility for special education. And so once they sort of age out of their IEP, they continue to receive a partial SNSP scholarship, which is remarkable and unexplainable from my point of view, but they do. They're called a partial scholarship student. So if they no longer qualify for special education, they would not qualify for actual cost accounting services either. Anything else to say about that? And someone is asking for contact information for FIRE. So I'm sure Katie will provide that for us right now.
Yeah, so you can learn more about FIRE, firemke.org. My email address is on the bottom of this slide, as well as our phone number. And we're happy to take any questions anytime on this topic from anyone. I also see in the chat, what documentation should we provide for staffing costs? Those payroll records, as long as they show what has been paid to the specific employee, and they're going to want to see like every pay period, that should be sufficient. You wouldn't actually need a copy of the contract in that case. I think that's more of an either or. So if you didn't want to provide the full payroll record and you had a copy of the contract for a salaried employee, you could provide that. For an hourly employee, you're going to need the actual payroll record. And yes, FIRE is an organization that serves just Catholic schools. If you're not a Catholic school, you could still reach out to me. I would strongly encourage you to look at what's out there and available. Most foundations and granting organizations are looking for a one-time grant opportunity. They don't want to fund, a paraprofessional for a student for 10 years, but they would be interested in the situation where they have this one-time opportunity to support a student and really kind of set them off on their educational journey. I know that there were a lot of Lutheran schools registered for this. And I will say, like in the Lutheran Church community, for example, I know there are many foundations interested in this type of opportunity. So don't be afraid to reach out, even if you're not a Catholic school. I'm happy to follow up with you on that.
All right. Well, thank you so very much, Lauren and Katie, for being our guests and doing just such an exceptional job of walking through this material. And we hope that it's been helpful and encouraging to all of you. We will be sending out to you a clipped version of this presentation today, and along with the slides. And feel free to reach out to School Choice Wisconsin. Also, if you have questions, we're all here together to try to help students get access to these resources. So have a great day, everyone. Have a happy summer. Take care.